Now, as we get closer towards 12 months of the greatest government being elected and 12 months of the greatest year in Australian history, a joke, of course, as we close in on the first anniversary of the Albanese government, the moment, of course, when they were able to get a majority, win in the parliament and become the government for at least the next 3 years. You're going to read a lot of really boring, sort of backslappy, kissy profile pieces of the Prime Minister and how he's planning to change the world or is changing the world or is the greatest leader of all time, or occasionally, just occasionally, you might hear someone say, maybe the Emperor's clothes are not as covering as everyone wants to think. In fact, 12 months on from the Albanese government's election, we got a very interesting opinion poll today that I noticed wasn't written up as a headline by the very organisation that reported it. It went nowhere on radio, and I didn't notice it being talked about on television until this exact moment. The Essential Poll, which appears in the Turnbull Times, asks people, how are you feeling 12 months on from the election of the Albanese government? Well, 14% of people and 7% of people say things have got better when it comes to dealing with climate change and how Indigenous Australians are being treated. However, how do you feel 12 months on from the election of the government? Backwards, 9%. Australia is a place to live. Well, apparently it's 11% worse under Albo. Your job prospects for the average school leaver are 11% worse than when Albo took over. Your life overall, 12 months under the Albanese government, 14% worse. Political debate in Australia. Well, hang on, what didn't the Teals usher in this brand new era? There are no evil Liberals holding up anything and it's total control of the left? Well, political debate apparently is 21% worse than when they won government. But most importantly, your personal financial situation, 12 months after the election of a government that promised to do something about cost of living, is backwards 33%. Now, you know that old saying about a week is a long time in politics? Well, it feels like that because it was only 1 week ago tonight when the federal budget was being handed down in Canberra. Remember the weeks and weeks and weeks, almost a couple of months before that budget was handed down, it was the only thing you heard about when it came to federal politics. All roads led to a Tuesday in May when Grim Jim would stand up and make the world a better place. Well, 12 months ago, the Canberra bubble, which inside the Canberra bubble has the press gallery, which inside the press gallery bubble was all locked away for 7 hours, all decided to report 1 week ago on the greatest budget of all time, despite the fact that 33% of people believe, or I should say people believe that their finances are 33% worse.
Charles, cost of living is the #1 issue in Australia right now. Will this budget help?
Evening, Pete. It will, and it will help those that need it the most.
Some $20 billion in spending that hikes welfare payments, cuts power bills and helps some with rent.
Treasurer making it very clear tonight that this is a responsible, measured budget that will not be driving inflation. In fact, the cost of living package is expected to drive inflation down by 0.75% by the next financial year.
I love Stella at Channel 10, so I'm not going to criticise her. But what is interesting of many people when they reported on the budget 1 week ago, it was the Treasurer says, the Treasurer believes. Interestingly, when you go back and have a look at the media coverage from 12 months before that, it's things like the Treasurer claims, the Treasurer thinks. Not so subtle change in the bias of the political reporting. But as we've told you, 1 week later, the thing that was missed by so many people on this night 1 week ago, with the exception, I immodestly say, of this program when we were doing a 90-minute program, is that the cost of living is going to go up because they've introduced a tax on transport. There's changes into what truckies have to pay. Everything in Australia moves around on a truck. When it comes to the fresh produce, they too are going to be paying extra when it comes to taxes. Now, interestingly, we again see an opinion poll about people's view of the budget 7 days on. And the media coverage that you saw 7 days ago does not match the polling that again says today in the Turnbull Times, otherwise known as The Guardian, that just 24% of people say the budget was good for them. Just 13% of people believed that there was a financial beneficiary when it was News Poll and somewhere in between on the Channel 9 papers. And 7 days on, the Australian Financial Review is doing what it did on budget night, but certainly has sharpened its coverage since, basically talking about how the numbers were fiddled with. Wearing credit, of course, for the reporting of Philip Curry. He was the one who told you that the only reason they got to a surplus wasn't just because of an explosion in commodity prices, but also because they are able to add the profits of the Future Fund. That, of course, was set up by Peter Costello and John Howard to make sure that there were billions of dollars to pay for superannuation of the public service. No one's been able to count the profits of that until now, until Chalmers. And if Frydenberg was able to do it, he too would have had a surplus, but it would have been $3 billion bigger 4 years earlier. But the lefty Jedi mind trick is in place. Remember when this was all about helping people at the low end of town, and then once it became obvious that the vast majority of people who were the 10 million people who had a tax increase on them in this budget realised you're taking more than you are giving me, and you are giving an awful lot when it comes to welfare. Well, Jim Chalmers doesn't care about any of that because he, of course, is on a not-so-slow move to eventually wanting to become the Prime Minister of Australia. Now, I'll give you the tip. Here's the plan, right? Well, Albo, most likely, 2-3 terms. Somewhere through the third term, Chalmers would think, because he's done all the excellent work on the economy, despite the fact that debt and deficit gets worse each and every one of those years, despite the fact that the original promise of hiring him as the Treasurer was to fix both of those things, he thinks he'll become the Prime Minister. So he's out and about and doing what every Treasurer does when it comes to the week after the budget, turning up on Q&A on the ABC. Now, this is all about saying, here I am, 1 hour of TV, how good's Jim, how good's insert Treasurer. But then watch what happens when he is confronted by the reality that this bloke who's lived in a bubble of either working for Treasury, working for politicians, being a politician, now being a Treasurer, earning a couple of $100,000 where you don't talk about people, you talk about numbers, you don't talk about real life, you talk about politics. That he's convinced himself that he has solved the problems of the poverty of Australia, only to be actually confronted with the people who he and Albo lied to 12 months ago, that by voting for them, the cost of living would get better. Instead, it's worse. It's a lot worse.
You have 2 mortgages, from what we understand, and I'm keen to know what personal sacrifices have you had to make since the interest rates have increased?
I'm obviously not going to go into kind of my own circumstances, and that's because my focus is on the pressure that the broader Australian community is under.
Sorry? I'm not going to answer your question because my focus is not on your question. Could you imagine again? I'm sorry you have to say it, but it's true every time. Imagine that was Josh Frydenberg. Imagine if that was Scott Morrison. Imagine if that was Malcolm Turnbull. Imagine if that was Joe Hockey. Sitting around at some point in time having to talk about the finances of the country. Oh, look, I won't directly answer your question because I'm just going to pivot it over here. And the media, they would have gone nuts for the full 24 hours. But again, I bet this is the first time you're learning about any of this outside of the very few who watched that thing live last night. And again, Jim Chalmers got a dose of reality. He has convinced himself that in one budget, like Moses, he has parted the seas of poverty and he has saved people's lives. But I repeat, those people were lied to by Labor. They were lied to by Labor on an assumption that by voting for them, something substantial would change. Instead, those people got played. They got played by politicians who take them for granted. Politicians who say, vote for us because we will change your life. But then when they get into power, the only reason you should vote for them is because they're better than the other guy or girl in opposition. Here were real people with real questions, and the Treasurer had nothing.
It used to be possible to raise a family and purchase a home on one income. Mr. Treasurer, that's no longer an option for a lot of us in Western Sydney. Between my wife and I, we have 3 incomes, just trying to keep up with all the soaring bills and groceries. How many incomes can you see families needing in future generations?
At the moment, my entire pension is my rent. I live off family tax benefit A and B.
Why would we increase migration by 700,000 when we can't look after the people we have here? We've got 122,000 homeless in Australia.
Correct. All questions that if Peter Dutton asked them, apparently it was racist. When the bloke from Mission at Parramatta, which is a charity that among others looks after the homeless, you've got to answer the question. But of course he didn't. But then there is a question that was asked very directly, and it represents the vast majority of people in this country who actually fund the federal government. The people who don't take, but instead money is taken from them to fund the federal government. Firstly, her question was excellent. Secondly, pay attention to Chalmers' non-answer. But thirdly, have a listen to the scoffs of the people in the crowd who are outraged that the lady who's actually paying tax wants to know what's in it for her.
Why are all our policies, politics and budgets catered to serving and benefiting the less fortunate? It appears to me that I would be better served by my government if I was unemployed, didn't go to university and was a single parent, rather than working a 14-hour-day corporate job funding myself, my family and my education. What's in it for me? Where's my incentive to save, invest, dream big and make a success of myself?
Oh. Well, Ananya, I mean, we recognise and support the legitimate aspirations that you have to succeed in the field that you've chosen.
This bloke is slippery. This bloke is very well polished. This bloke is going to get many a pat on the back from the media because today he said that the one thing he desperately wants to do for the Australian economy, the thing that they will be judged upon is the transition when it comes to power. Now, yes, at a certain point in time, the expectation is we're going to get to 80% renewables by 2030. But how many times does your power bill have to go up? Yours in Middle Australia for them to get their goal, for him to turn around and say, I changed the country. What do you do for poverty? Next question, please. What do you have to say to the people who actually paid the tax to pay for the transition? Next question, please. Now, this guy, again, he's got plenty of champions, and if you think Albo's a protected species by the media, this bloke is coming a very close second. But outrageously, after the scoffs and carry-on that you heard from the audience towards the lady who was working, paying her taxes and doing her bit, to the guy who wouldn't answer the question about what's happening when it comes to his own personal interest rate situation. Guess what we learnt of today? They are giving a pay rise to all federal public servants. The expectation is that this will be 10.5%. 10.5% is what they're going to end up with. And don't forget, every MP gets an extra staff member to deal with climate change. I'll talk about all of this with John Howard in a moment or two's time. He's in Seoul in South Korea.